This week, chapter 10, we're going to be talking about gender. This is the first video in this week's series, and I am going to start you out with a little flashback just to have a little fun, something from my high school days. So that's a little salt and pepper to get you started, and their video, Let's Talk About Sex. We are talking about sex this week, but not that kind. This week, our discussion is all going to be about gender. So let's first start off with a little discussion about the difference between sex and gender. So what is sex? We're not talking about the verb here, we're talking about the noun, the biological distinction between what is male and female. So we're talking about those external sex, physical characteristics. We're talking about looking at the DNA and the XY chromosomes. That's what we're referring to when we're talking about sex, not like salt and pepper. But when we talk about gender, we're more looking at the expectations and the behaviors that are associated with a certain sex category. So what it is to mean male and what men are supposed to act like and look like, what it means to be a woman and how women are supposed to express their femaleness. So sex is the status and gender is the role. Remember when we talked about statuses and roles? So the status or the category that someone occupies within the social structure that's what sex is. And gender are those norms, those behaviors, those expectations. And I think that this topic is very relevant, especially these days when we're looking at people who are crossing those lines. I mean, it's always happened that people have crossed those lines, but now we have people that are wanting to express a different type of gender and maybe even change their sex characteristics in order to closely better align with their presentation of gender. So let's talk a little bit about gender identity. So gender identity is the awareness of being masculine or feminine, and this is based upon culture. So it's important to note that this is based upon culture. And what that means is whenever you are in American culture, being male and female is very different than maybe if you would go into a different culture. So, and also remember that this is time based. So what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman changes as time goes on. So I'm using as an example, Batman. So most of you in the class are probably too young to remember the original Batman, and he's the one that's on the left. The one on the right is the Batman that we know today. Now, I know the pictures are small, but you can hopefully get close enough and you can see the differences between Batman in the past and our current Batman. If you would have watched the cartoons, you could look it up on YouTube. The original Batman, he was kind of a doof. He was clumsy, he made mistakes. There would be times where his cape would come up over his head and he would stumble upon it. You can see he's not very muscular. He's kind of soft looking, kind of a really silly guy, did silly things. And when they would punch, it would be bam, pow, those little blurbs would come up. Our current Batman, look at his muscles. Look at the stance, how he's standing. He's like demanding a presence. And the current Batman, that is someone that is feared in the movies. So that is just kind of a visual representation of what our ideal about what masculine and what a hero represents, how that's changed over time. Think about our current day celebrities, the ones that we consider being very masculine and being very mannish, if that's even a word. the gender expression in our culture today about what it means to be male is strong, a provider, a hero, courageous, not afraid, doesn't show emotion. That's not what that has changed over time. Even if you think about past James Bond characters and how those have changed over time, it's just showing that this gender identity isn't something that's fixed. It's something that changes over time. It is the expression. Remember, we're not talking about sex here. We're talking about gender, which is the expression of what it means to be male and those expectations of what it means to be female. And it's the same for women as well. Gender socialization is this process in which we, boys and girls, remember the socialization process never ends. It starts from the time that they're little, about how girls learn to be girls and how boys learn to be boys. It's that old little rhyme, girls are snips and snails and puppy dog tails. No, wait, that's boys. Girls are sugar and spice and everything nice, and boys are snips and snails and puppy dog tails. Kids learn at a very early age of what it means to be a girl and what it means to be a boy. I have a little example here on the screen that you can see. Think about when you're driving through a McDonald's drive-through. I can't tell you the last time I've been to a McDonald's. It's not a place that I routinely go to. I try and stay away from that kind of food. But when my kids were really little and I would get them Happy Meals, you would get up to the window and they would ask you, do you want a girl toy or do you want a boy toy? Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, in the little image here, it's a joke, okay? Me. Would you like a Hot Wheels or a Barbie toy with that, ma'am? It's for a boy. Okay, congratulations. Do you want a Hot Wheels or a Barbie toy? I want a boy toy, please. Ha ha, don't we all? It's a joke, right? But these things did happen. Why does a girl toy have to be a little doll or a Barbie, and why is a boy toy a Hot Wheels? That isn't something that's rooted in our DNA. It's something that we have learned over time about what's acceptable for girls to play with and what's acceptable for boys to play with. And it's much more than just toys. It's the expressions that go along with it, where girls learn to be caretakers. They learn to be emotional. They learn to care about how they look, that they have these examples of Barbies and American Girl dolls and that look of perfection. And boys learn to play rowdy, to race cars, to be aggressive, to be competitive. Again, these are just small things, but they happen over time. I had to take a pause there for just a moment. So how did we get here? How did we get to this point and these different expressions of gender? Well, first we're going to take a quick look at biological determinism. This is the idea or the theory that behavioral differences between men and women are linked to physical characteristics. So what it's saying is that men act the way they do and women act the way they do because of those differences, those biological differences that we have. Okay. Now, I would want to take a little side note that sociology disagrees with this. And why? Well, because we have that strong belief and theory about socialization and how we learn about things is taught to us from previous generations, and we continue learning throughout our life. And if this were true, then that means that all men and all women across the world would behave differently. Similarly, I'm sorry. If this were true, men and women, all men across the world would behave the same, and all women across the world would behave exactly the same or very similar. Okay. So what are the differences? There are differences, of course, between men and women. What are they? Well, we have different muscle, bone structure, and fatty tissue location on our bodies, okay? So women hold fatty tissue in different places. It assists with, carrying children and supporting children by feeding them. We have, of course, different reproductive organs, and we have different chromosomes. And then there are a few different areas of our brain that that our brain works differently. It has to do with hearing and the way that we process the things that we hear. Okay. So there is other research out there that proves that men and women are different in other ways, but it's very difficult. You'll note at the bottom of this slide, we can't rely on most of those research studies because there are so many out there that contradict one another. And you remember from chapter 2 when we talked about research methods, it's hard to rely on things when they contradict each other. You don't have that validity there. And most research focuses so much on the differences, but it ignores all of the other similarities that men and women have. So you see, there's 4 things here on how we're different, but just think of the numerous ways that we are the same. So, how do we know that these things are not biologically based and that it's more about the way that we learn and the socialization process? Well, 2 examples I'm going to give you. So if you want to follow along on your book on page 277, there is some cultural evidence. So at the top of the slide, I have a quote there from Margaret Mead. So who was Margaret Mead? Margaret Mead was a very influential anthropologist, and some could say sociologist, that would go to different societies and study people. Well, what she did is she did a study of 3 primitive New Guinean peoples, okay? New Guinean peoples that were isolated from other societies around them. And she looked at these people and she studied them. So things that we would typically think of when you think about more feminine traits. Those found in Western society. So again, we would know that these things were biologically based if men and women act the same worldwide. But her study of these 3 primitive tribes who were isolated from the outside world in New Guinea shows that people can be socialized to show any different type of gender stereotypes that we would typically think as being all male or all female. So let's give you another study. How about studies of babies? So I'm going to read to you the bottom of page 277. Studies have also been conducted on infants whose parents intentionally treated their children as if they belonged to the opposite gender. Apparently, individuals can fairly easily be socialized into the gender of the opposite sex. What's more, after years, these children resist switching back. These studies indicate that biological tendencies can be greatly influenced by culture and society. So, if we're able to do these studies on twins, which might be a little unethical, but it shows that there is a difference there is a high influence rate when it comes to socialization and how important the socialization process is to this. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back to talking about baby studies.